The house had never been this quiet. Not in 22 years. Not once. Edward Calloway had filled every corner of that estate with noisy dinner parties that spilled onto the terrace until midnight, the laughter of business associates who called themselves friends, the particular kind of loud confidence that money generates when it believes in its own permanence. There had always been footsteps in the hallway, always a voice somewhere, always the distant clink of crystal or the low murmur of conversation drifting up from the parlor below. Always something to remind him that he was the center of a very large, very warm world. Now there was nothing. Just the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Just the hum of the refrigerator running empty in the kitchen. Just the sound of his own breathing in a house with 14 rooms and not a single other person in it. Edward sat in the leather chair by the window of his study, the one that faced the garden, and he did not move. The television on the wall behind him played the same segment on a loop because he hadn't reached to change it. The headline crawling across the bottom of the screen was not subtle. It never was in moments like this. Calloway Capital in freefall, it read. Insider sources confirm total asset collapse. And beneath that, in the breathless shorthand of financial news that made catastrophe sound like theater, once billionaire Edward Calloway left with nothing overnight. He hadn't corrected it. He hadn't called his publicist. He hadn't posted a rebuttal or scheduled a press conference or fired off the kind of measured statement his communications team would have drafted in 30 minutes flat. He had simply let the headline run. Let the story breathe. Let the world believe what it needed to believe. Because that was the point. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The thing about power, truly lasting power, is that it is not found in what you own. It is found in what you are willing to lose in order to discover the truth. And Edward Calloway, at 58 years old, after 20 years of building an empire and 3 years of suspecting that empire was being hollowed out from the inside, had finally reached the point where he needed to know. He needed to see who stayed when staying meant nothing, who came when coming cost them something, who disappeared the moment the headline scrolled across the bottom of a screen. He hadn't expected it to happen so fast. The first to go was Diane, his partner of 3 years, elegant, attentive, the kind of woman who knew which wine to order without looking at the list and always said the right thing at the right moment. He had not loved her in the way that undoes a person, but he had been comfortable with her, and comfort, for a man who spent his days navigating risk, had felt like enough. She had come into the study 40 minutes after the news broke, her face composed in the careful way of someone who has already made a decision and simply needs to announce it. She hadn't cried. She hadn't pretended. She had simply set her key on the edge of the desk, told him she was sorry, and said that she needed to be honest with herself about what she could handle. He had nodded. She had left. The door had closed with the soft, final click of a chapter ending. Then the call started. Or rather, the call stopped. His phone had rung 47 times in the first hour after the story broke. Associates, investors, people who attended his birthday gatherings and his charity galas and his holiday parties. People who had his private number and thought nothing of using it. By the second hour, the calls had slowed to 12. By the third hour, the voicemail had stopped filling. By evening, the silence had settled in like something solid. Like furniture nobody had arranged. Victor had not called. That absence, that particular silence from a man who called twice a week without fail, who had sat across from Edward at boardroom tables for 15 years and said the words "your most trusted partner" more times than Edward could count, that was the one that told Edward everything he needed to know about what was truly happening inside the walls of his company. Victor Harlan had been Edward's business partner since before Calloway Capital had a name. They had started in a rented office with bad lighting and a coffee machine that didn't work properly. They had shaken hands over a lease they couldn't fully afford and built something from the particular stubborn energy of two men who had too much pride to fail. In the years that followed, they had weathered market corrections and hostile bids and the kind of slow institutional pressure that broke lesser companies apart. Victor had been the one Edward called when his wife, Margaret, was diagnosed. Victor had been at the hospital. Victor had been at the funeral. He had stood at Edward's side at the graveside service, and afterward, in the black car on the way back, he had said, "I'm not going anywhere, Ed. Not ever." 3 weeks ago, Edward's head of internal security had placed a file on his desk and sat down with the expression of a person delivering news they didn't want to be responsible for. The file was 42 pages long. It documented a pattern of financial transactions, subtle ones, the kind designed to look like normal institutional noise that traced a slow and deliberate movement of capital out of Calloway Capital's secondary funds and into shell accounts that connected, after several careful steps, back to a single individual. Victor Harlan had been stealing from the company for 2 years. Not carelessly, not greedily in the obvious way, surgically, patiently, the way a person who knows a system inside out chips away at it without ever breaking the surface. The plan Edward had devised with his security team and his private legal counsel was simple, if uncomfortable. Stage the collapse. Let the story leak to the financial press through a controlled channel. Watch what Victor did. Watch what everyone did. Let the silence and the absence tell the truth that 42 pages of documentation couldn't tell on its own, that the only people worth trusting were the ones who showed up when showing up served them nothing. He had expected loneliness. He had not expected how complete it would be. The house staff had been part of the arrangement. Edward had met quietly with each of them, explained that he needed them away from the property for a period, that their contracts were protected, that they would be compensated in full. They had been professional and kind and concerned. He had thanked them each individually, which he realized now, sitting in the silence, was not something he had done often enough in the years before this one. The housekeeper who had been with him for 6 years had squeezed his hand before she left. The groundskeeper had offered to come back. Off the clock if he needed anything moved. Small gestures, large grace. Clara Reyes had been the last to go. She had worked in this house for 22 years. She had arrived the year Edward and Margaret moved in, a young woman with a quiet efficiency that Margaret had noticed immediately and remarked on with the particular certainty of someone who recognized a rare thing. She had stayed through everything. Through the growth of the company and the birth of the social life, and the years when the house was full, and the years when it was quieter, and the long, terrible year when it was darkest. She had moved through these rooms the way water moves, present, essential, and somehow invisible to people who weren't paying attention. Edward had told her the same thing he'd told the others, that it was temporary, that she should go home, rest, that everything was going to be all right. Clara had listened without interrupting. She had folded the dish towel she was holding, folded it twice, precisely, the way she always did when she was thinking, and she had looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. She had said, "Mr. Calloway," in her quiet, measured voice, "is there anything you need before I go?" He had said no. She had nodded once, picked up her bag from the kitchen chair where it always sat, and walked to the door. She had paused with her hand on the frame, her back still to him, and for a moment he thought she might say something else. But she didn't. She just pulled the door shut behind her with the gentleness of someone who understood that silence could be a form of care. That had been 4 days ago. On the 5th morning, the knock came at the back door. Edward almost didn't hear it at first. He had been in the kitchen, making coffee with mediocre success, the machine being the kind of complicated European device that Clara operated with ease, and that he could not fully decode, and the knock was quiet, not demanding. 3 times, evenly spaced. Patient. He crossed to the door and opened it, and there was a young man standing on the back step with a paper grocery bag in his arms, and a look on his face that was trying very hard to be casual and not quite succeeding. Marco Reyes was 24 years old. He had his mother's stillness and his mother's eyes, the same quality of attention in them, the same careful observation that didn't announce itself. He was wearing his work clothes, the simple dark shirt and trousers of the restaurant kitchen where he worked as a line cook, and his hands, Edward noticed, were nicked along the knuckles in the way of someone who spends hours with knives and heat. He was not someone you would look at in a crowd and think, there is a person of consequence. He was not someone you would look at all, if you weren't paying attention. He held the bag out slightly, as if presenting it for inspection. "My mother made food before she left," Marco said. "She told me to bring it over after a few days so it wouldn't all go bad." He paused, "and I added some things." Edward stared at him. The morning air was cool and smelled like grass and the faint diesel of the service road behind the garden wall, and for a long moment he couldn't think of a single thing to say. "Come in," he finally managed. Marco followed him into the kitchen without commentary on the mess, which was considerable. He set the bag on the counter and began unpacking it with the practical economy of someone who was used to working in limited space. A container of Clara's rice, the kind with the sofrito base that Edward had eaten 100 times without ever asking what was in it. A container of black beans. A foil-wrapped package of something that, when Marco lifted the edge, turned out to be baked chicken, simple and golden, the kind that required patience. And then, from the second layer of the bag, Marco's additions: a loaf of bread from the bakery 3 blocks from where he worked, a bunch of bananas, 2 cans of soup, a container of orange juice. "It's not complicated food," Marco said, in the tone of someone who has thought about whether that mattered and decided it didn't. "But it's good." Edward's throat tightened in a way that surprised him. He had spent 5 days in this house, without feeling much of anything beyond the cold arithmetic of isolation, noting absences, cataloging silences, feeling the shape of who was gone, and drawing conclusions from it. He had been efficient about it. Clinical. He had not cried, had not permitted himself the indulgence of feeling what the loneliness actually was. He was, after all, running an operation. He was in control of this. But something about the container of rice, something about the loaf of bread and the 2 cans of soup, and this quiet young man who had come to the back door of a house whose owner the whole world had declared a ruin, something about all of it sat down on Edward's chest with a weight he hadn't anticipated. He turned away and pretended to look for a plate. "You didn't have to do this," he said. Marco was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "Nothing else. Just that." They ate in the kitchen because the dining room felt wrong, too large, too formal for the reality of the moment. Marco put the food on the counter, and Edward found 2 plates with only minimal difficulty, and they ate standing up the way people eat when sentiment hasn't yet figured out how to become ceremony. Marco ate with the unhurried appetite of someone who had been on a morning shift and was running on 4 hours of sleep and 1 cup of bad coffee. He did not ask Edward how he was doing. He did not offer condolences or commentary on the news coverage or an opinion about the financial situation. He did not say anything that required Edward to perform a version of himself. He just ate, and let Edward eat. Outside, the garden the groundskeeper had maintained with such devoted precision was beginning to show the first small signs of neglect: grass slightly longer at the edges, a flower bed with a few wilting stems. The morning light came through the kitchen window at the low, sideways angle of early spring and made everything look temporary, the way light does when you're paying attention to it. After a while, Edward said, "Your mother, is she all right?" Marco looked up from his plate. "She's fine. She went to stay with my aunt in Bridgeport for the week." He paused, and something moved behind his eyes, a calculation, a decision. "She didn't want to go," he said. "I had to talk her into it." Edward set his fork down. "What do you mean?" Marco looked out the window. He had the quality of someone choosing words the way you choose a path through uncertain terrain, not slowly, but carefully. "She said she didn't feel right leaving." He picked up his fork again. "I told her you'd asked everyone to leave, that it was part of a plan. She didn't believe me." Edward's chest tightened again. "She doesn't know," he said. "About the plan?" "No," Marco said. "She just knows you're alone in this house." He glanced at the hallway beyond the kitchen, the long, dark hallway that led toward the foyer and the 14 rooms of silence beyond it. "She said that was enough reason to stay." The grandfather clock in the foyer ticked. Somewhere in the garden, a bird started and stopped. Edward picked up his fork. He took a bite. The rice was exactly as it always was, the warmth of it, the particular seasoning he had never once tried to identify or replicate because it had always simply been there, part of the texture of this house, the way the walls were, the way the floors were. The food of a person who had been in these rooms for 22 years and had made them livable in ways no one had ever formally acknowledged. He thought about Margaret. He thought about the weeks after the diagnosis when Clara had quietly started leaving small things on the kitchen counter: a thermos of tea, a plate covered in foil, food that was easy on a stomach disrupted by treatment. No announcement, no offer of condolence, just the food, appearing morning after morning, without ceremony or expectation of gratitude. He thought about how he had never once asked Clara how she was doing during that time. Not really. He had thanked her, in the way that employers thank staff: efficient, appropriate, acknowledged, and released. He had never sat across a counter from her and asked what she was carrying. He looked at her son, this quiet young man who had gotten up before a full shift at a restaurant, packed a grocery bag, driven across the city, and knocked 3 times on the back door of a house the world had declared worthless. "Why did you come?" Edward asked. Marco considered the question seriously, the way people do when they've been asked something that deserves a real answer. He set his fork down and looked at Edward directly, not with the careful deference that most people used when addressing him, not with the particular downcast quality of someone who remembered their place. Just directly. The way you look at someone when you've decided they're worth telling the truth. Because nobody else did, Marco said simply. The clock ticked. Because nobody else did. Edward said nothing. He looked down at his plate. Outside, the spring morning was getting on with itself, indifferent to the kitchen and the two men in it and the weight of what had just been spoken in 7 words. He had staged a collapse to find the truth. He had built an elaborate apparatus of controlled deception to see who would stay and who would go. He had measured the silence carefully, catalogued the absences, noted the strategic disappearances of people who had called themselves his partners and his friends. He had done all of this with the cold precision of a man who believed he was in control of what he was going to discover. He had not expected it to arrive at the back door in a paper bag with a loaf of bread and 2 cans of soup. He had not expected it to stand in his kitchen in a restaurant uniform with quiet eyes and eat without making a production of the gesture. He had not expected it to feel like this, not like a data point, not like confirmation of a theory, but like something warm being handed to a person who had forgotten what warmth felt like. He picked up his fork again. He ate. Marco did the same. The clock ticked on. Graceful secrets, full script premise. Millionaire pretended to lose it all. Only the maid's son came back with food part 2 of 3. Marco came back the next morning. Edward hadn't asked him to. There had been no arrangement made. No invitation extended over the empty plates before Marco had quietly washed them, stacked them, and let himself out through the back door the same way he'd come in. Edward had stood at the kitchen window and watched him walk down the garden path to the side gate, the paper bag folded neatly under his arm, and had thought, that's the end of that. A single act of kindness, clean and complete, offered without expectation of return. But at 7:45 the following morning, the back door knock came again. 3 times, even, patient. This time Marco had coffee, real coffee, the kind from the place on Merchant Street that Edward had been to twice and whose name he could never remember, but whose paper cups he recognized immediately. He had a bag from the same bakery as before, and inside it were 2 egg sandwiches wrapped in white paper, still warm, and a small container of fruit that someone had cut up carefully, the pieces even-sized, the way a person cuts fruit when they're thinking about the person who's going to eat it. Edward stood at the door for a moment longer than necessary before stepping aside to let him in. You have a shift today? Edward asked, because it was the only practical question he could think of. Afternoon, Marco said. I'm off until 2. They ate the sandwiches at the kitchen counter again. The coffee was very good. Edward said so, and Marco nodded, like the acknowledgement had been expected but was still appreciated. Outside, the garden was brighter this morning, the light coming in with a little more conviction than the day before, and somewhere in the hedgerow near the east wall a bird was conducting an extremely dedicated argument with itself. On the 3rd day, Marco brought groceries instead of prepared food. Actual groceries, a full bag, items chosen with the consideration of someone who had mentally walked through someone else's week and planned for it. Pasta, canned tomatoes, olive oil, eggs, a block of cheese, coffee filters, bread, 2 apples. He set them on the counter one by one and said, I thought you might want to cook something yourself. He said it without looking up, in the tone of a person offering a person their dignity back. Edward looked at the groceries for a moment. Then he said, I don't cook. Marco glanced at him. I know. He paused. My mother always said you could burn water. Something shifted in Edward's face. A small thing, not quite a smile, not quite not. My wife said the same thing, he said. Marco's hands stilled briefly over the counter. Then he resumed arranging the items with the same quiet efficiency. She was right, he said. But you can learn. He stayed that morning and showed Edward how to make pasta. Not a complicated pasta, nothing that required technique or patience beyond the ordinary, but real food, made from real ingredients, in a kitchen that had been silent for 5 days. Edward was a poor student in the particular way of people who are used to being competent, and Marco was a patient teacher in the way of people who have spent time in professional kitchens and know that frustration is just the beginning of skill. By the time they sat down, the pasta was slightly overcooked and the sauce needed salt, and Edward ate it with a concentration that had nothing to do with the food. "This is terrible," Edward said. Marco looked at his own bowl. "It's not great," he agreed. Edward ate another bite. "But I made it." Marco nodded once. "Yeah, you did. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." It was on the fourth day, a Thursday, that Edward found the envelope. He had been doing what he'd been doing in the odd hours when Marco wasn't there, and there was nothing else to occupy his hands, moving through the house slowly, room by room, in the way of a person reacquainting themselves with a place they'd stopped truly seeing. He had spent years in this estate without looking at it. Years during which the rooms had been maintained and polished and arranged by other hands while he moved through them like a man walking through a stage set present, but not inhabiting. He had forgotten, he realized now, the specific quality of the light in the upstairs hallway in the late afternoon. He had forgotten that the floorboard outside the guest room made a particular sound, a low groan of settled wood that had a voice as distinct as a person's. He had forgotten that Margaret had painted the hallway herself, years ago, a warm shade of off-white that was slightly different from the standard paint the decorators would have used, and that if you stood at the right angle in the right light, you could still see the faint variation in the brushstrokes where she'd done it in sections over 3 Saturdays. He was standing in the hallway outside the study when he saw the edge of the envelope on the shelf of the small alcove table near the window. The alcove table was where Clara kept the things she found around the house: keys that had been left in coat pockets, loose change, the occasional small item that had fallen behind furniture and needed to be returned to its owner. Edward had walked past that table without looking at it so many times that it had effectively ceased to exist for him. The envelope was small, cream-colored, already opened. His name was written on the front in Clara's handwriting, precise, slanted slightly to the right, the hand of someone who had learned to write carefully and never stopped. There was no stamp on it. It hadn't been mailed. It had been left for him. He stood in the hallway for a moment with the envelope in his hand. Then he carried it to the chair in the study, Margaret's chair, the one she had always sat in when she was reading, the one he never sat in himself, and he sat in it and took out the letter inside. It was a single page, written on both sides, and it was dated 3 weeks earlier, the same week the security file had been placed on his desk. Clara's letters were like Clara herself, direct, unhurried, and honest without performance. She wrote that she had not known whether to say what she was going to say for a very long time. She wrote that she had watched him for 22 years and had learned, over that time, the difference between things that were her business and things that were not, and that this particular thing had lived in the second category until recently, when it had moved, without asking permission, into the first. She wrote about Margaret. In the year after the funeral, Clara wrote, she had noticed that the visits to the cemetery had become irregular. Not because of carelessness, she knew that. She knew that Edward carried his grief the way he carried everything, privately and at a weight that did not advertise itself. She knew that the irregularity of the visits was not distance from Margaret, but the opposite, that some mornings he would get in the car and not be able to make himself go, and would drive instead to the waterfront and sit there and come home 2 hours later with salt on his coat and not say where he'd been. She had started going herself. On Wednesdays, on her day off, she had taken the bus to St. Augustine's and sat with Margaret for a while. She had brought flowers when she could, simple ones, the kind that didn't cost much but lasted well. She had spoken quietly, the way you speak to someone who is listening even if you can't hear the answer. She had paid a small amount each month to the cemetery's maintenance service to ensure the headstone was properly cleaned and the plot was kept tidy. She had done this for 4 years. She had not told him because it was not something she had done for acknowledgement. She had done it because Margaret had been kind to her from the first day she arrived in this house, had spoken to her like a person and not like a function, and had remembered the names of her children and asked after them genuinely, and once, during a particularly difficult winter, had quietly left an envelope with Clara's coat that contained enough money to cover the gap in the heating bill that Clara had been trying not to think about. Margaret had done these things without ceremony and without expectation of return, and Clara had decided that the best way to honor the dead was to behave in the spirit they left behind. She wrote one more thing. She wrote that she was telling him now because she was worried about him, not about the company, not about the money, not about what was being said on television. About him. About the specific quality of the silence she had heard in his voice the morning before she left, and about the fact that she had spent 22 years learning the difference between a man who was handling something and a man who was enduring it. She was worried, she wrote, that he was confusing the two. She signed it simply, Clara. Edward sat in Margaret's chair for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the floor of the study in the slow, patient way of light that has nowhere to be. The clock in the foyer ticked. The garden outside the window went from bright to gold to the softer, more complicated color of late afternoon. When Marco knocked at the back door at 4:30, he'd finished his shift, he said, and he'd brought soup from the restaurant. Nothing fancy, just what they'd had on the line. Edward let him in and said nothing about the letter. He put the soup in bowls. They sat at the kitchen table. They ate. At some point, without making a decision about it, Edward said, "Did your mother ever talk about my wife?" Marco looked up. He considered the question carefully, the way he always did. "A little," he said. He set his spoon down. "She said she was a good woman, that she made people feel like they mattered." Edward nodded, looking at his bowl. "She did," he said. "That was exactly what she did." Marco was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My mother does that too." Edward looked at him. Marco met his eyes with the same steadiness he always had, not challenging, not performing, just there. "I know," Edward said. It was the truest thing he had said in 5 days. The call from Victor Harlan came on Friday evening. Edward was in the garden when his phone rang, not the main line, but his private cell, the number known to perhaps a dozen people, the number Victor had been using for 15 years to reach him at any hour without ceremony. The sight of Victor's name on the screen produced a particular sensation that Edward recognized from the security team's briefing 3 weeks ago. The sensation of a pattern confirming itself. He let it ring twice. Then he answered. Victor's voice was warm, carefully constructed warmth, the kind that sounds natural until you've spent enough time listening for the seams. "Ed," he said. "Ed, I've been trying to reach you for days." "My phone's been quiet," Edward said. "That's what I heard." Victor's voice shifted, sadder now, thicker with concern. "Listen, I've been talking to people about the situation. I want you to know I'm not going anywhere. You know that, right?" Edward looked at the garden. The hedgerow near the east wall. The slightly too long grass at the edges. "I know," he said. "I want to help," Victor said. "That's why I'm calling." He paused in the particular way of someone who has rehearsed a pause. "There's a way out of this, Ed. There's a structure we can set up, something that protects your remaining assets, moves them into a vehicle that's insulated from whatever's coming next with the regulators. But it needs to happen quickly." He paused again. "And it needs your signature." Edward was quiet. "I know this is a lot," Victor said. "I know the timing is terrible, but I'm doing this for you. You know that." Edward looked at the sky above the garden, pale blue, early evening, a thin cloud moving from west to east without urgency. He thought about 15 years. He thought about the file that was 42 pages long. He thought about the shell accounts and the surgical precision of it, the patience required to steal from a person slowly enough that they didn't notice the warmth leaving. He thought about Marco Reyes standing at the back door with a paper bag. 3 knocks, even impatient. The simplest thing in the world. "I appreciate it," Edward said. "Let me think about it overnight." Victor said, "Of course." Victor said there was no pressure. Victor said to call him any time, day or night. That's what partners were for. Then he hung up, and the evening resumed its quiet, and Edward stood in the garden for a long time before going back inside. He found Marco washing the soup bowls at the sink. Edward said, without planning to say it, "I need to ask you something." Marco turned off the water and turned around, drying his hands on the dish towel, folding it precisely afterward, the same way Clara always did, the habit passed down without being taught. He waited. "If you knew something about a person," Edward said, "something they'd done, something that showed you exactly who they were, would you act on it, or would you wait?" Marco looked at him steadily. "That depends," he said. "On what?" "On whether waiting means someone gets hurt." Edward held the young man's gaze. "And if waiting meant you could be certain?" he asked. "If you needed one more day to make sure the trap was closed before you moved?" Marco was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, "My mother always told me don't wait so long to act right that you run out of time to do it." Edward nodded slowly. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out his phone. He unlocked it and dialed a number. When the call connected, he said, "It's time. Close it." He hung up. Marco stood at the sink with the dish towel in his hands and waited with the patience of someone who had learned that not every question needed an immediate answer. Victor Harlan, at that moment, was sitting in his own study on the other side of the city, pouring himself a glass of something expensive and feeling, for the first time in 2 years, that the long game he had been playing was finally about to pay out. He had the asset transfer documents ready. He had the legal structure in place. He had spent 2 years moving money quietly and carefully, and he had spent the last 5 days watching his oldest friend sit alone in an empty house and believe that everything was over, and now all he needed was a signature. He did not know, as he lifted his glass, that Edward Calloway's private legal team had been working with the Financial Crimes Unit for 3 weeks. He did not know that every call he had made in the last month had been monitored under a lawful order, and that the call he had just made in which he had outlined a fraudulent asset transfer structure to a man he believed to be financially desperate had been recorded in full. He did not know that the 42 pages of documentation the security team had assembled were currently sitting in a file with an attorney general's investigator, and that the window he believed was still open had, in the last 60 seconds, closed. He did not know any of this yet. He sat in his study, in his expensive chair, with his expensive glass, and believed that he had won. He believed that tomorrow he would have what he'd been working toward for 2 years: the final transfer, the final signature, the final clean exit from a partnership he'd been quietly dismantling piece by piece. He raised his glass to no one in particular. Meanwhile, in a kitchen on the other side of the city, Edward Calloway put his phone back in his jacket pocket and looked at a young man in a restaurant uniform holding a folded dish towel, and felt something he had not felt in 5 days, or possibly much longer. He felt like himself again. Not the version of himself that lived on the financial pages and the charity galas and the boardroom table. The other version. The one that knew the difference between the life he had and the life he had actually lived. The one that could sit in a kitchen with a quiet young man and eat mediocre pasta and understand that this was the wealth he had been spending without knowing he was spending it. "I want you to know something," Edward said. Marco waited. "What your mother has done," Edward stopped. Reconsidered. "What your mother is," he said, "to this house. To me." He shook his head slightly, not in frustration, but in the particular way of a person who has just realized that words are insufficient for the thing they're trying to carry. "She left me a letter," he said, "before she went." Marco's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. Something moved through them, quick and warm and immediately composed. "She told me," Edward said, "about Margaret, about the cemetery, about the flowers." Marco looked down at the dish towel in his hands. "For 4 years," Edward said quietly. "She never said a word." Marco folded the towel once. He looked up. "She wouldn't," he said. Edward nodded. "I know." The kitchen was quiet. The clock in the foyer ticked. The garden had gone dark beyond the window, the last of the evening light absorbed into the spring ground. "Why didn't she tell me?" Edward asked. And he was not asking about the cemetery, not exactly. He was asking something larger. Something about 22 years of a woman moving through his house, caring for its rooms, caring for the people in it, and never once demanding that the care be seen. Marco thought about it for a long moment, with the care of someone who had an answer and wanted to say it correctly. "Because she wasn't doing it for you to know," he said. He paused. "She was doing it because it was right." He looked at Edward directly. "She doesn't need people to see what she does. She just needs to be able to sleep at night." The silence that followed that sentence was not empty. It was the kind of silence that contains a reckoning, the sound of a person understanding, perhaps for the first time, what they have been given and what they have not, until now, known how to receive. Outside, a car passed on the road beyond the garden wall. Inside, the clock ticked. And in that kitchen, in the space between a question and its answer, something shifted that could not be shifted back. Graceful secrets, full script premise. Millionaire pretended to lose it all, only the maid's son came back with food. The news about Victor Harlan broke on a Saturday morning. It did not break quietly. Nothing about Victor had ever been quiet, not the way he entered rooms, not the way he conducted business, not the way he laughed at his own jokes a half-second before anyone else did. And so it was consistent with his character, in a grim way, that his undoing came with the particular volume of a story that financial journalists had been waiting to write for years. The kind of story that arrives fully formed, with documentation and named sources and a timeline, so clean it reads like a verdict. Which, in most important senses, it was. The headline was simple: Harlan charged with corporate fraud and asset theft. Beneath it, In the measured language of people who have been very careful with facts, authorities confirm longtime business partner of Edward Calloway orchestrated a 2-year scheme to defraud Calloway Capital of an estimated $47 million. Arrest made early this morning. Edward read it on his phone in the kitchen, standing in the same spot where he had stood for the past 5 mornings making mediocre coffee, and he felt none of the things he had expected to feel. He had thought there would be satisfaction in it, the clean, hard satisfaction of a trap closing around something that deserved to be caught. He had thought there might be relief. What he felt instead was something quieter and harder to name. Not grief exactly, but the nearest neighbor to it. The particular weight of having been right about a person you had trusted for 15 years and wishing, somewhere beneath the vindication, that you had been wrong. He set his phone face down on the counter. Outside, the garden was doing what it did every morning now, going about its business with or without him, the birds, the light, the grass that was still slightly too long at the edges but which he had decided, sometime in the middle of the week, he didn't mind. He had spent 5 days learning to be in this house without the performance of occupying it, and something in that process had rearranged things that he hadn't realized needed rearranging. He heard the back gate. Not the knock, the gate, the hinged iron gate at the far end of the garden path, the one that gave a specific sound when it was opened by someone who knew to lift it slightly as it swung to prevent the drag. It was a small thing, the kind of thing you only knew if you had used that gate 1,000 times. Edward had used it perhaps a dozen times in 22 years. He knew someone who had used it every day. He crossed to the kitchen window. Clara Reyes was walking up the garden path. She was not supposed to be back until Monday. She walked the way she always walked, with a steady, unhurried purpose that had nothing to do with where she was going and everything to do with who she was. She was wearing her coat, the gray one, and she was carrying her bag on her left shoulder and a paper bag in the crook of her right arm, and her eyes were on the path in front of her with the expression of someone who has made a decision and is simply executing it. Edward went to the back door and opened it before she reached the step. Clara stopped. She looked at him. Then she looked at the door, which should not have been open yet because she had not yet knocked. She understood what it meant that he had seen her coming, and something in her expression adjusted for it, accepted it. "Mrs. Reyes," he said. "You're early." "I know," she said. She held up the paper bag. "I brought breakfast." He stepped back. She came inside. She moved through the kitchen in the immediate, natural way of someone returning to a place that is theirs in some true sense that has nothing to do with ownership. She set her bag on the chair. She set the breakfast on the counter. She looked at the coffee machine which Edward had finally, by the 4th day, learned to operate with minimal error, and then she looked at the coffee Edward had already made, sitting in the pot, and she said, without inflection, "You figured out the machine." "Trial and error," Edward said. "Mostly error." She almost smiled. She took her coat off and hung it on the hook by the door, the second hook, the one that had always been hers, and she began unpacking the breakfast. Pastries from the bakery. Fruit. A small container of something that smelled like the egg dish she made on weekend mornings, the one with peppers and onions that Margaret had loved and that Edward had always eaten without mentioning how much he looked forward to it. He watched her for a moment. She moved with the ease of long practice, reaching for plates without looking for them, knowing where everything was the way you know the layout of a room in the dark because your body has memorized it. "Marco told me you were coming back today," Edward said. Clara's hands didn't slow. She nodded once. "He told me you didn't want to leave," Edward said. That made her pause. Brief, small. Then she resumed, placing the pastries on the plate. "No," she said. "He told me I had to talk her into it," Marco had said. Edward understood now the particular weight of that sentence. She hadn't left because she wanted to. She had left because her son had asked her to, and she trusted him. The same way she trusted most things quietly, without requiring explanation. "Clara," Edward said. She turned. She looked at him directly, the way she rarely did. Not because she lacked confidence, but because her particular form of dignity expressed itself in restraint, in the space she consciously chose not to take up. Now she took it up. She looked at him fully, and waited. "I found your letter," he said. Her expression didn't change. She had known he would. That was why she'd left it. "For years," he said. "Every Wednesday." Clara looked at the counter. "Yes," she said. Edward exhaled slowly. "Why didn't you tell me?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Then she said, Because you already had enough to carry. The simplicity of it was what got him. Not the gesture itself, which was extraordinary, which was the kind of thing that most people would never do and almost no one would do without telling someone, but the reasoning behind it. Because you already had enough to carry. As if her own quiet grief, her own Wednesday mornings on a bus, her own carefully chosen flowers were not things she was carrying at all. As if what she did for the people in this house was simply what people did, if they were paying attention and had the capacity and happened to love someone who was gone. He had been thinking, for 5 days, about wealth. About what it actually was. About the 47 million that Victor had been carefully extracting and what that number meant in the context of the last week. In the context of pasta that was slightly overcooked and bread from the bakery, and 3 knocks at the back door from a young man in a restaurant uniform, and a letter on cream paper in handwriting that slanted slightly to the right. He had been building an empire for 20 years, and he had been, simultaneously, failing to understand what an empire was actually for. He crossed to the kitchen table. He sat down. Not in the host's chair, not in the chair at the head of the table, where he always sat when he sat in the kitchen at all. He sat in the middle chair. The everyday chair. The one Clara used when she sat down for a moment between tasks, which was not often. He said, "I want to talk to you about some things. And I want you to sit down while we do it." Clara looked at the chair across from him. She looked at Edward. Something passed through her expression that he recognized now. After 5 days of watching her son, the same calculation, the same careful decision about whether a thing was safe to receive. Then she pulled the chair out and sat. He told her, first, about Victor. About the file, the investigation, the controlled collapse, the arrest that morning. He told her plainly, without omission, because she deserved the full picture, and because he was done, he realized, with the habit of managing information around the people in his life as if they needed to be protected from the truth. Clara listened without interruption. When he finished, she said, quietly, "I never trusted him." Edward looked at her. "You never said anything." She folded her hands on the table. "You never asked," she said, "and it wasn't my business to offer." He thought about that for a long moment. He thought about how many times in 22 years he might have asked and hadn't. How many observations Clara had made and kept to herself because nobody in the architecture of his life had ever made space for them. He had built a world of advisors and partners and associates, and had not once thought to ask the woman who moved through every room of his home and knew every person who entered it what she saw. "I'm asking now," he said. Clara met his eyes. She said, "I saw a good man who worked very hard and forgot, sometimes, to look at what was right in front of him." She paused. "Margaret saw it too. She talked about it sometimes. Not unkindly. She loved you. She just worried you confused movement for living." The kitchen was completely quiet. Somewhere in the house, the clock ticked on. Edward sat with what she had said and did not try to argue with it or soften it, because it was true and they both knew it was true. He reached into his jacket, the same jacket he'd been wearing all week, the expensive one now somewhat creased, which Margaret would have teased him about, and he took out a folded envelope. He set it on the table and slid it across to Clara. She looked at it. She did not reach for it. "This isn't the full conversation," he said. "This is just the beginning of it. But I needed to start somewhere concrete." Clara looked at him. Then she picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside were 2 things. The first was a letter on Calloway Capital letterhead, brief and formal, confirming the establishment of a dedicated education fund in the name of Margaret Calloway, to be administered in perpetuity, providing annual scholarships to students from working-class backgrounds pursuing degrees in healthcare, education, or the arts. Margaret, who had been a teacher before she met Edward, would have approved of the specificity of that. She would have approved of the healthcare piece especially, and of the arts piece even more. The second thing was a deed. Clara unfolded it slowly. She read it once. Then she read it again. The way you read something when you're certain you've misunderstood it, and are hoping the second reading will reveal the error. It was the deed to the small house on Clement Street, 3 blocks from the bus stop, 2 blocks from the bakery where Marco bought the bread. A house that Edward had purchased 4 years ago as part of a small residential portfolio that his property team managed. A house that, according to the deed now in Clara's hands, was being transferred, fully and without condition, into her name. "I can't," she started. "It's done," Edward said gently. "The transfer was filed this morning." Clara looked at the deed. Her hands, which had folded dish towels and carried plates and cleaned rooms and arranged flowers on a grave for 22 years, were perfectly still on the paper. "You have given this house more than it ever gave you," Edward said. "That isn't a debt that can be repaid. I know that. But I want you to have something that's yours. Something that doesn't depend on employment or circumstance or whether any of the rest of this holds together." He paused. "You deserve a place that belongs to you." Clara looked up. Her eyes were bright, but she did not cry, because Clara Reyes was not a person who cried easily or publicly, and she was not going to start now in a kitchen she had cleaned 1,000 times. But her eyes were bright, and her chin held the particular steadiness of someone working very hard to stay composed. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Edward," he said. "Please." She looked at the deed again. She folded it carefully along its original lines and placed it back in the envelope. She held the envelope in both hands for a moment, looking at it. Then she looked up at him. There was something in her expression that Edward recognized from the letter, the thing she had said about Margaret, about speaking to someone who is listening even if you can't hear the answer. There was a quality in Clara's face right now of someone who was being heard, perhaps for the first time in a very long time, by someone who had finally stopped being too busy to listen. "Thank you," she said. The word was simple. It landed the way simple things land when they mean everything they say. Marco arrived at 9:30, as he had every morning that week. He came through the back gate with the particular lift-in swing that prevented the drag, and Edward, who was standing at the kitchen window with his second cup of coffee, watched him come up the path. He was not carrying anything this morning. He didn't need to. He had been coming to this house for 6 days with food in his arms, and today, apparently, he understood that something had shifted, that the house was no longer empty in the way it had been, that the particular hunger he had been quietly addressing had, in some fundamental sense, been fed. He came to the back door. He knocked. 3 times, even, patient. Clara opened it. Marco stopped. He looked at his mother. He looked at the kitchen behind her, the plates from breakfast, the coffee, the chairs pulled out from the table in the way they only look when people have been sitting and talking. He took it all in with the quick, careful perception of someone who notices everything and says very little about most of it. "You're back early," he said. Clara held the door open wider. "Come in." He came in. He stood in the kitchen and looked from his mother to Edward and back, and he said nothing, because there are moments that don't require commentary, and Marco Reyes, at 24, already understood this better than many people do at twice the age. Edward set his coffee cup down. He looked at the young man who had knocked at his back door 6 mornings ago with a paper bag and a quiet face and no expectation of return, who had come back every morning after that, who had shown him how to make pasta and drunk coffee from the place on Merchant Street, and said, in 7 words, what 15 years of professional advisors had never managed to say. "I want to offer you something," Edward said. Marco waited. "The restaurant where you work," Edward said. "It's good. I've heard good things about it." Marco's expression shifted slightly, wary. "Okay," he said. "Is that what you want? To cook there?" Marco considered that. He cooked because he was good at it, and it paid reliably, and it required the kind of focus that kept his mind organized. Whether it was what he wanted was a question he had not yet had the time or safety to fully examine. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. Edward nodded. "I'd like you to find out." He paused. "There's a culinary program in the city. Professional, 18 months, fully accredited." He kept his eyes on Marco's face. "I'd like to pay for it. No conditions. No repayment. And if at the end of it you decide you'd rather do something else entirely, that's fine too." He paused again. "The point isn't the program. The point is the option." Marco looked at his mother. Clara was watching him with the expression of a woman who has spent 20 years working so that her children would have choices she didn't, and who is now watching one of those choices materialize in a kitchen she has cleaned 1,000 times. Her expression was composed, but only just. Marco looked back at Edward. He was quiet for a long moment. "Why?" he said. Edward had expected the question. It was exactly the right question, Marco's question, the one a person asks when they've spent a lifetime being careful about what they accept and from whom. "Because you showed up," Edward said. "When it cost you nothing to stay away. You showed up anyway." He met the young man's eyes. "That's rare. It shouldn't go unrewarded." Marco looked at the floor. He looked at his mother. He looked at his hands, the nicked knuckles, the hands that had cut fruit into even pieces for a man he barely knew because it seemed like the right thing to do. Then he looked at Edward and said, quietly, Okay, it was enough. The garden needed work. The grass at the edges, the wilting stems in the east bed, the general sense of things having been left to their own devices for a week. The groundskeeper was coming back Monday, but Edward went out into it that afternoon anyway, not to fix anything, just to be in it. He walked the path along the hedgerow. He stood for a moment near the east wall where the light came in at the low angle. He looked at the garden the way he had been learning, this week, to look at things, not past them, not through them, but at them, for what they actually were. He thought about Victor, about 15 years and the weight of a betrayal that had been patient enough to survive all that time without announcing itself. He thought about the file and the shell accounts, and the recorded phone call in which Victor had offered to help him with warm and careful words while holding a pen above a document designed to finish what the theft had started. He thought about what it meant to be deceived by a person you trusted at a level that close. And he thought, not for the first time, that the worst thing about that kind of betrayal wasn't the money. It was the rewriting, the way it reached backward through every shared memory and inserted a question mark. Then he thought about Clara's letter on cream paper, about Wednesday mornings and a bus route and flowers chosen because they lasted well, about the specific shade of off-white Margaret had painted the hallway, and the sound of the floorboard outside the guest room, and the way the light moved across the floor of the study in the late afternoon. About things that had been present and tended and true for 22 years without requiring his attention or his acknowledgement or his understanding. He thought about Marco at the back door. 3 knocks, even impatient. There is a version of this story in which the drama is Victor, the arrest, the exposure, the 47 million, and the years of surgical deception. That is the version that ran in the financial press that Saturday morning, and that people forwarded to each other with the particular energy reserved for stories about powerful men who fall. But that was not the story Edward carried with him as he stood in the garden that afternoon. The story he carried was smaller and truer. It was about a woman who had loved his wife quietly and privately, and without recognition for 4 years after the funeral. About a young man who had learned from that woman what it meant to show up without fanfare. About a week in an empty house that had turned out not to be empty at all, that had been, in every room and every corner, full of the evidence of people who had cared for it, and for the people in it without anyone ever asking them to. He had spent 20 years building wealth, and the week had taught him something he could not have purchased. That the people who are invisible in your life are often the ones holding it together. That the silence around service is not absence, it is the opposite of absence. And that sometimes the most important thing a person can do with everything they have is use it, finally, to see. He went inside. The kitchen was warm. Clara was making dinner, something that smelled of onions and slow heat, and the specific comfort of a meal prepared by someone who knows exactly what they're doing. Marco was sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook, writing something, a recipe, perhaps, or notes from a phone call, or the beginning of something new. The clock in the foyer ticked on. The light through the window was evening gold. Edward sat down at the kitchen table. Not at the head. In the middle chair. The everyday chair. The one that felt, more and more, like the right place to be. Clara set a glass of water in front of him without asking. Marco looked up from his notebook and nodded once, the way he always did, acknowledging, unhurried, present. How long until dinner? Edward asked. 20 minutes, Clara said. He nodded. He picked up the glass. He looked at the garden through the window. Going dark now, the last of the light pulling back toward the horizon. In 22 years, he said, not to both of them, not to either of them, just to the kitchen, to the room, to whatever was listening. I never once sat here like this. Clara kept her eyes on the pot. I know, she said. A pause. Then, simply, I'm going to be better at it. Clara said nothing, but her shoulders released something, a small, quiet release, barely visible, the kind of thing you only see if you are paying attention. And Edward, for perhaps the first time in 22 years, was paying attention. Marco went back to his notebook. The clock ticked. The dinner cooked. The evening settled in around the house like something that had been waiting patiently for the people inside it to be still enough to receive it. And in the end, that is what this story is about. Not the arrest. Not the 47 million. Not the vindication of a man who outsmarted a fraud. Those things happened. They mattered in the way that facts matter. But the thing that changed Edward Calloway, the thing that reached into the architecture of how he understood his life and rearranged it permanently, was a knock at a back door. 3 times, even impatient. A paper bag with a loaf of bread, and 2 cans of soup. A young man who came back every morning for no reason except that nobody else did. And a letter on cream paper that said, in the handwriting of a woman who had never asked to be seen, "I was worried about you. Not about the money. About you." The people we overlook are not invisible because they lack worth. They are invisible because we have stopped looking. And sometimes, if we are very lucky, life arranges itself into a week that forces us to be still enough, quiet enough, hungry enough to finally see what has been there all along. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.